let's talk about some albums. G'day guys, Tommy here, and once again we're doing something a bit different, but going to do something a bit more fun. You guys seem to like the personal type videos, like Moose. This one I think want to have a bit more fun, and I think this one we can have some fun with the subject matter. People on Twitter more or less know about this, but not so much the people on YouTube. Besides video games, which is what I'm primarily known for, another massive passion of mine is music. In actual fact, my video game collection and my album collection are pretty well on par in terms of quantity. So what I have here is my favourite albums of all time. I've got 5 of them here. I thought we might have a bit of talk about them and give you guys some recommendations. Let's get on with the first one. Spanish Train and Other Stories by Chris de Burgh. This is Chris de Burgh's second album, the follow-up to Far Beyond These Castle Walls. And the main reason I love this album is actually in the title, Stories. These songs don't feel like just songs, they feel like short stories. There's a lot of attention to detail in the lyrics and the storytelling, which I absolutely love, which sort of goes against what I normally do with music, and that's not pay much attention to the lyrics. I'm not a lyric guy. I find that a lot of times it's the same subject matters, repeated and repeated, just battered to death and used and abused. And a lot of times they get in the way of the really interesting instrumental side of the piece, and a lot of lyrics just don't sing well. And there's a quote by Mike Rutherford that I love, basically where he's saying, lyrics are all well and good, but they have to sing well and fit, and a lot of times they don't fit and they don't sing well, and that goes for 95% of lyrics I've heard. Not the case with this album. You've got your sort of serious storytelling in This Song For You and The Tower and Just Another Poor Boy. You get sort of the creative side of things with Spanish Train and A Spaceman Came Travelling. They both sort of have like religious overtones. I mean, God and the devil playing games over the souls of the dead. But it's actually very interesting. And then, for a little bit of cheeky fun, you've got The Painter and Patricia the Stripper, and they're fun. But this is just, and this is not like what Chris de Burgh is known for, which is like Lady in Red and that type of stuff from the 80s. This is more kind of like the Irish folk singer in a way. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Chris de Burgh's early work, from like this album up to The Getaway, this, At the End of a Perfect Day, Crusader, and Eastern Wind and The Getaway. This is such a good album. Next one. This next album I'm going to show is technically a soundtrack. However, the way it was released, it kind of looks like its own album, and that is Opera Sauvage by Vangelis. This album is the soundtrack to a Frederick Rossif documentary called L'Opera Sauvage. But also, what a lot of people don't know is that how good this album is. This album was originally going to be the soundtrack to Chariots of Fire. They were that close to sign the deal. Vangelis was happy with it, and all of a sudden Vangelis said, you know what, I can come up with something better for this film. And we got Chariots of Fire. But this one I absolutely love. The creativity on this album is very interesting, because like certain Vangelis albums, it can be very subtle. It can be very direct, but a lot of times it can be very subtle. And if you don't pay full attention, it kind of glosses over you. There's aspects of this which is very atmospheric and minimal, like soundtrack, but then it picks up in places as well. There's a piece on here called Chromatique, which has this very interesting guitar part on it, with Vangelis over the top. Then the sparse electric piano that Vangelis does early in this, and then picks it up, is really interesting. And then you've got the final piece on here, which actually has John Anderson of Yes on harp. John Anderson doesn't sing. This album doesn't have any singing on it. But John Anderson shows up playing the harp, and the piece goes for about 6-7 minutes, I think. And it's Vangelis and John Anderson, and just seeing once again how those two worked. And this is before they formed John and Vangelis. They had worked before on Heaven and Hell, which John Anderson sang on. Absolutely incredible what they did together on that album. And then also Vangelis was this close to joining Yes when Rick Wakeman left. Ultimately that didn't happen, and they got Patrick Moraz, because this is around the time of Relaya. But the interplay between Vangelis and John Anderson on this is wonderful to listen to. This whole album is just really very, very atmospheric, but it can hold your interest. Sometimes atmospheric can lose people, but this doesn't. This really holds your interest. And also, this happens to be I've recently learned this happened to be one of Vangelis' popular albums, which I didn't know about. I always kept hearing about other ones. Evidently, this is really high up with people. Yeah, this is just such a fantastic piece of work. Next one. So in recent years, when you mention multi-instrumentalists, everyone always seems to shout one name: Prince. And for good enough reason. However, Prince isn't the first multi-instrumentalist. There were people before him. And one name that really should be up there with Prince in terms of composition, immense skill and talent as a multi-instrumentalist, and actually the person why I'm was a multi-instrumentalist when I was younger before my arthritis got worse, and also in terms of level of creativity and genius that should be up there, is Mike Oldfield. I mean, this is the guy that came up with Tubular Bells, for Christ's sakes. I really feel that Mike Oldfield should be up there as well, and deserves to be. This is actually his third album. This is Ommadawn. This followed up Hergus Ridge, which I know to the audience at the time and to Mike Oldfield himself, it was a little bit on the disappointing side. I actually like Hergus Ridge. I don't love it, but I do like it a lot. and actually the more I listen to it, the more and more I take away from it and really do like it. So I have nothing against Turkish Ridge. But this album, this shows another side to Mike Oldfield that wasn't really shown on Tubular Bells, and not awfully huge amount on Turkish Ridge. That's his Celtic and folk background. Very massive on this album. But also, Ommadawn is very well known for having a massive section with African rhythm, which Mike Oldfield has revisited quite a few times in his career, including what was a follow-up to this, Amarok, and also the direct sequel to this album, Return to Ommadawn, back in about 2015-16, I want to say, that album came out. This album really just shows how good Mike Oldfield is with working with other people as well. He does quite a lot of the instruments on this, but he does work with some other people. And it does show how well that he can work. Although in his past he did work with Kevin Ayres and his sister Sally Oldfield in a folk duo called Sally Angie. Whereas Tubular Bells really was his own sort of massive project, even though he was only about 19 when he did that album. This one is a different side to Mike Oldfield, but you can still recognise that it's the same guy that did Tubular Bells. This album, the subtleties that Mike Oldfield does is absolutely fantastic. It does get sort of a bit atmospheric on side 2, and it does take a while. It is building up, and then it sort of all comes together at the end. Whereas part 1 is sort of a bit more instantaneous, but that's not a detrimental thing at all. And then of course it finishes with a little sort of ditty at the end, which is On Horseback, which Mike Oldfield talks in, and then other people jump in and sing on it. Great album. It's basically 3 pieces of music: Ommadawn Part 1 and Part 2, and then the little On Horseback at the end of side 2. Fantastic album. Next one. This is probably it's my second favourite album of all time. There is one that is number 1. It does get on top of this, but it doesn't take away from this album. Now, as a lot of people on Twitter do know, it's quite well known that I'm a massive fan of Genesis, and it's probably no surprise with the albums I've shown so far. I'm a massive fan of Genesis with Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett. Real emphasis on Steve Hackett there. But the album I'm showing actually doesn't have Peter, but it does have Steve. It's Wind and Wuthering. This is the second album they did with Phil Collins on lead vocals, because a lot of people don't know is that even though Peter Gabriel was the lead singer, there are instances where Phil did lead vocals on songs. There is For Absent Friends on Nursery Crime, and then there is More Fool Me on Selling England by the Pound. This album is the follow-up to Trick of a Tail, which was the first one with Phil on lead vocals. This one is, on first listen, a bit harder to digest than a Trick of the Tail. Trick of the Tail is more instantaneous. This one does take a little bit. It took me a tiny bit to really sink in with it. But what really grabs me about this is the romanticism. This is a very romantic album, and when I say romantic, I mean romantic structure. It's a musical thing, very heavily inspired by the romantic period of classical music, and that's mainly due to Tony Banks, the keyboard player. A lot of this album is driven by Tony Banks. However, the strongest piece on this album is actually written by Phil Collins and Steve Hackett. It's called Blood on the Rooftops. Absolutely incredible piece. It's got one of the most wonderful nylon stringed acoustic guitar pieces by Steve Hackett at the beginning, which Steve Hackett does a lot of, and I never get tired of his nylon string playing, Steve Hackett. And then it goes into the main part of Blood on the Rooftops, which is a romantic piece of music about sitting watching the telly. But there's also other wonderful pieces on here. There's one Tony Banks wrote called One for the Vine. Fantastic piece. Wonderful composition and structure. Same with Blood on the Rooftops. This also has a fantastic piece that closes the album called Afterglow. Wonderful piece, one of the best pieces Genesis had. Genesis still, up till 2007, was still performing Afterglow pretty regularly. Steve Hackett's always revisiting Afterglow when he's playing live. In fact, Steve Hackett redid a version of Afterglow with John Wetton on vocals. That version is utterly fantastic. John Wetton's performance on it is wonderful. The late great John Wetton from King Crimson and Asia and Roxy Music. Wonderful, and UK. Wonderful version. But the one thing I really love about this is the romanticism. Every time it rains, and it's a rainy day, I always put this on. I love it. Yeah, this one's a real fan favourite, and it's certainly my favourite. It's the last one they did with Steve Hackett, a full album. There was an EP after this called Spot the Pigeon, which had some bits that didn't make this album. There's one piece on there called Inside and Out, and oh yeah. But this I love. Next one. This one I think I'm going to have trouble showing, because the album cover is green. I think it's going to key out. This is my favourite album of all time. Absolute favourite, and it's been my favourite now for years. Since I was a teenager. I cannot believe that an album like this exists at all. And I cannot believe that there's an album like this which is this brilliant and this incredible. And it's Close to the Edge by Yes. This is 1972. It's their 5th album, following up the successful Fragile. This, people thought that Yes couldn't do any better than Fragile, and this just, yeah. This album is one of the most interesting albums I've ever listened to, and the first listen I will never forget. I will never forget. It's probably the most intense, mind-boggling listening sessions to an album I've ever had. And even still, the more I listen to this album, the more I can, and I'm familiar as all hell with this album. But the more I sit there and go, the more I sit there and listen, and the more I delve into it, I still keep coming back amazed and utterly impressed. First off the bat, one of the things you always notice, and it has to be mentioned about Yes, is their now long-running collaborations with Roger Dean. Beautiful gatefold cover. I think some of it might be hanging out, but absolutely wonderful. Yes and Roger Dean are synonymous with each other, even though they haven't worked on everything, but they pretty well go hand in hand, and Roger Dean is seen as like an unofficial member of Yes. But really, it's an album. As much as Roger Dean's artwork is a part of it, it is about the album. And where do I start? Well, first of all, one thing that has to be addressed is John Anderson's lyrics. Now, this is not like Spanish Train Love Stories. I do love the lyrics of this album. However, you can't pay attention to them. There's no sort of instantaneous meaning to them. They're there because they sing well. And John Anderson is primarily using his voice as an instrument. A lot of times you find with bands, there's the band and then there's the singer, and it's slightly separate. John Anderson never had this approach. And one of the things that is really impressive about John Anderson is how he pronounces words when he's singing with his accent. But John Anderson has always encouraged people to try and find some meaning in his lyrics to make it more engaging. But primarily John Anderson is using his voice as an instrument. Kind of like scat singing. Jazz singers for years have been doing scat singing. They don't sing words. And it's basically using their voice as an instrument. John Anderson does the same thing, but he uses actual words instead of scooby-doo-boo-boos. The rest of the band, Bill Bruford on drums. This was the last album he did with Yes, and before Union. There was that big chunk of time where Bill Bruford was with King Crimson, and then UK had a stint with Genesis, went back to King Crimson, he came back for Union. But this is always considered to be like Bill Bruford's final Yes album, even though there is Union, but Union's a big mess of a story, and people don't even know if Rick Wakeman and Bill Bruford are even on the album. They were replaced by session musicians on The Secret, we don't know. Also, Steve Howe's guitar work, absolutely incredible. Also, Steve does a fair bit of writing on this album, absolutely incredible. Chris Squire's bass work is, as per usual from Chris Squire, stellar. Rick Wakeman's keyboard work on this is absolutely phenomenal, like Rick Wakeman's playing. And then you get to the compositions. This album has 3 pieces of music. That's it. Close to the Edge, the piece itself, is 20 minutes long. It takes up all side 1. Then there's 2 songs on side 2, both about 9 minutes long. And You and I and Siberian Khatru. When you first listen to Close to the Edge, the actual piece Close to the Edge itself, you will be sitting there wondering what the hell is going on, and that it doesn't make sense. You go from this wild, chaotic introduction section, and then morph into sort of the main structure of the piece. But even that itself is loose structure, and they keep messing with that structure later on. You go on this one thing and you're understanding it, but you're still wondering where the hell they're going with this and what they're up to. At that point you go into this other section, which is completely different, complete change, different atmosphere, different feeling, bit more quieter, but once again it builds up again. Goes a little bit more on the wild side again. Gets back to what was originally done in the first main section. It's a recapitulation, but in a different key. And then all of a sudden, you're still wondering what the hell's going on, where they're going with this. And then you cut to what they make is the end. And it's another recapitulation in a different key. At which point then, that's the moment that it clicks. It doesn't make sense until the last 2 minutes. I know this sounds completely bonkers, but it does work. It works extremely well. Close to the edge, the piece does not make sense until the last 2 minutes, at which point then it makes perfect sense, and you've been on this absolutely intense, emotional roller coaster of a ride through music, and you're just sitting there, completely mind blown, boggled, almost out of breath. And from everyone that I've told to listen to this, they've all walked away amazed. And then they realise that that's only side one. You do get an album's worth in side one alone. You then got to deal with side two. You deal with And You and I, probably one of the greatest pieces Yes has ever done. Absolutely fantastic piece of music. That's another roller coaster. That one's a bit more easier to understand. You're a bit more comfortable going for the ride with And You and I, unlike Close to the Edge. But with And You and I, there are sections, but it does seem seamless. Same with Close to the Edge. Close to the Edge, once it makes sense, does seem seamless. And then the album finishes with Siberian Khatru. Siberian Khatru is not a roller coaster. It does pretty well make sense almost straight away. I've heard when people try to criticise this album, they always come to Siberian Khatru finishing the album. I don't have an issue with that. A lot of people feel that maybe it was a weak ending. I don't think so. I think it's good. You've been on this massive roller coaster for a side and a half worth of an album, and now you come to this part, you're still getting thoroughly impressed, but it's more digestible. Yes would do the massive ending on Relaya, which works extremely well. And once again, that's only got 3 pieces of music. It sort of follows the structure of this, but is completely crazy on another level than this. Those 2 albums are both a different kind of crazy, but fantastic crazy that we need. I can't believe an album like this exists, but I'm certainly glad that an album like this exists. I've always walked away with spine tingles when I listen to this, always. And I've lost count how many times I've listened to this album, the other albums I've showed you, I've lost count how many times I've listened to it. This album is utterly impressive to me still. I don't know how many years later. I don't know how many years later. This album always amazes and impresses me, and is one of the most amazing pieces of musical work. It really is. A terrific record. Absolutely terrific record. Well, I hope that's been a bit of a an interesting and fun little chunk of time you spent with me on this. Something a bit different, not game related, still very personal, but a bit more fun than last time with Musha Less. That one had a lot more weight to it and was difficult to do. This one, a bit more fun, and it shows off the musical side of me than besides the video game soundtrack guitar covers I've done. I felt that this would just be a nice little one-off type thing. So anyway, thanks for joining. If you do listen to those albums, do let me know how you go with them. Of course, I've got my massive recommendation. Tell me your favourites if you have your favourites list or your one favourite album. Tell me that as well. Other than that, guys, I'm going to disappear. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you later.